I'm the coach at Copper Hills High School in Utah. We're an up-and-coming team. Look out. One day, you will all be our subjects. But before I coached in high school for the last 2 years, I coached in college for 10 years. Before that, I debated in college for 4 years. Before that, I debated in high school for 3 years in policy. I'm going into my 19th season of debate this year. So I've been in the game a long time. For a long time, my training was just like all the traditional training. I was controlling uniqueness on disads and thinking about solvency deficits on counterplans. And when I first I never had a coach in high school, so it just made sense for me to think that way. And at the time when I was in high school, the late 90s, the K was like a taboo, radical thing. It had been around for almost a decade by that time. Now it's just like normal, like you have to deal with the K to even survive in debate, but at the time it wasn't. When I got into college debate, it was really hard, and I found that my sort of no-coach high school, they dropped something approach was going to need to be supplemented by real scholarship. And I was going to need to develop a style and an approach that could help me win at the highest levels of debate. And the very first impression that I got after watching some good teams was that regardless of their style of debate, the best debaters had clearly read lots of books and studied lots of things and were scholars in their own right, and could go on to be scholars in various areas other than debate. They had areas of specialty, they had areas of interest. And so I searched for the thing that would be my thing, that I would begin my sort of academic progress and my scholarship on. And the thing that I found was a guy named Michael Shapiro, who was writing about the violent cartography of the American map. And he kept on saying this dude, Michel Foucault, everywhere. It was like all throughout the book. He kept on quoting Foucault and basing his different understandings of the political and his different theories on Foucault. And so I got into this guy Shapiro, and I read all of his stuff, and I started reading the Borders K, and we worked out really well, but it was clear that I would encounter a smarter person at some point in the bracket. I would go 4-1, all of a sudden I'm in a 4-1 debate against some really smart person that had also read this dude, Michel Foucault, was able to explain my argument at such a deeper level than I was able to. And I would lose that debate. So then I realized that I needed to even deepen further my understanding of this interest that I had developed. I had to go backwards to really understand a discipline, especially when it comes to philosophical critical research. You frequently have to trace backwards to find the foundation of the foundation of the foundation. You know, there's an ancient parable. It's like the world is on top of a turtle's back. And the universe is on top of a turtle's back. What's underneath the turtle? It's turtles all the way down. So the more I sort of tried to look to influences, and I got interested in this literature base and that literature base, the turtles kept on pointing all the way back down to Foucault, and I realized by the time I was like a junior in college, I really just need to be an expert on this Foucault, and then I can just master all the things that seem to be branching out of it. And the reason why it became a clever debater that would win some rounds with a trick here or there, because I knew this or that card well, I had some files and I knew the cards, to someone who could be comfortable in any debate, preparing for any topic, feeling confident that I could contribute to any political discussion, was when I started to realize that my true interest was in the works of Michel Foucault. And since then, my whole scholarly understanding of all the political issues in debate has become much more complex and rich because I've invested myself in this foundational understanding. What we're going to talk about today is just some fundamental concepts of Foucault. My goal is to teach you in some ways, how you can get mastery of the framework debate simply by reading books, reading about Foucault, and learning how his political orientation, his orientation towards political questions, has had significant and substantial influence on debate. The debate community created its current framework arguments, the framework debate that we have now on both sides, really out of copy-pasting political philosophy's debate about Foucault's writings. That's where the substantial cards in the framework debate really come from, most of them. It's really about political philosophy's reaction to the things that Foucault said. There's people saying that approach is bad, we need to use traditional orientations towards political philosophy. There's people that defend Foucault. All the cards come out of that conflict that we use in debate. Now there's other controversies within political philosophy, obviously, but because Foucault positions himself so well for debate stuff, understanding Foucault is really about understanding the framework debate. The framing arguments in Foucault can serve as K-framing, meaning K-arguments that suggest why the K should win the ballot and be the focus of the debate. For most Ks, almost all Ks, you could use Foucault framing arguments to frame your K. Criticisms of Foucault's work within political philosophy are some of the best and most substantive framework arguments that you can make against all Ks. You will see that after we're done talking today. So if I can teach you the kind of core political philosophy applications of Foucault as they apply to the political philosophy of debate, you will see that learning Foucault is really about mastering the framework debate on both sides. So, this lecture is going to be about applying and explaining Foucault's theories as they apply to a number of subjects. And those will be the topic, the subject, politics, the round, the state, debate. I have a little bit to say about Agamben, and activism. We will get to all that. If you can understand how Foucault applies to all those ideas, you can win framework rounds, and you can know more about the structure of debate itself. Okay, our first area. Before we get into it, Foucault was a philosopher born in 1925, died in 1984, French. Also known as a philologist, which is the same thing that Nietzsche was known for, which is just like the study of the origin of languages. Where does a word come from? What cultures produced it? What influences it's had? A cultural theorist. Some people call him a historian because he likes to look at the historical foundations of things. But he had such an influence on political, social, and philosophy in general, both ethical and just empirical, that so many of our contemporary disciplines have to deal with and come to terms with Foucault. Pretty much every social science department at universities have to, at some point, encounter Foucault somewhere in their theorizing. It's just hugely influential for a contemporary theorist. He was a philosophical rock star in his time. Okay, so let's start applying him. And hopefully by applying him to concepts, we can build a basic foundation and understanding for what he's talking about. The topic. I'm sure you've heard of the Panopticon. Please tell me you've... Hey, corpses, have you heard of the Panopticon?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. That prison who has a central tower in the middle of it, which you can't see into, but you can kind of see that people are looking out of. And so the prisoners, which all face towards it, know that they could potentially be being watched at any time. Okay? He says it's the most affected prison, originally theorized by Jeremy Bentham. The panopticon must not be understood as dream building. It is the diagram and mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. What he means by that is the panopticon is not just a really bad prison, it's a way for us to understand the flows of power and how power relations function, how our society works. It helps us understand the mechanism, the technology that is used to and employed in our society to create disciplinary control. So obviously the topic, because it's about surveillance, is incredibly just directly, literally relevant to a number of Foucault's writings. Okay? That's obvious because the question of surveillance ties directly to so many things that he wrote about. How do institutions control and discipline people? How do we deal with the deviance in our society, et cetera, et cetera. So that's obvious relationship with the topic. But there's a much more deeper relationship with the topic. Can I get a volunteer to come write the topic on the board? Okay. Did you forget something? That he did. There's that too. Unresolved colon. Oh. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. The one thing I want to say before we start diving into what just happened is the topic is more than the topic. The topic is more than the topic. The topic, oh, and we forgot the period. The topic is more than the topic. What do I mean by that? The topic is not just a collection of scribbly lines that make a literal sentence. It's not just simply an arrangement of symbols. It has exact cultural understanding for us, doesn't it? It has exact cultural understanding for us. When we see this phrase, is it this sentence, is it the same thing as when our grandparent sees it? No. When we see this, there's a whole host of things that we bring to the table to make this thing intelligible. Consider with me that there is a whole structure of intelligibility. Structure of intelligibility that makes this topic understandable to us. And what do I mean by that? I mean a whole series of cultural institutions, histories, backgrounds, personal experiences, relationships to language, your understanding of the competitive balance of ground, all year rounds, create all these things combined together to create a structure of intelligibility that makes this thing a thing that makes sense to you for some reason, that gives this thing its meaning for you. I would also like to posit that that thing means something a little different to every one of you in that light, given the structure of intelligibility that you bring to it. In fact, we could trace how many histories that made these words even possible at this moment. You know? This would not have a structure of intelligibility if we had never developed governments. We'd be like, what? Look it up, please. We wouldn't know so many different things. If there was no borders, we wouldn't know what this word meant. there are material, linguistic, and cultural structures which have existed and developed through social formation from the very beginning that have created the whole structure of intelligibility of this thing. And not just in your terms of your meaning interpretation, also your moral interpretation. You bring a moral substance to this as well. You have a reaction to what it means and why we would and what would motivate us to substantially curtail our domestic surveillance. You have a whole understanding of should, meaning the moral ought, meaning your own ethical understanding of progress, right and wrong. Your moral, religious, cultural institutions have conditioned the question of should for you. You now understand this is more than just a statement of fact. This is a moral choice. It is deeply embedded to you to react to that in a number of political ways. You have an understanding of the status quo and what is currently the state of things that allow you to understand that this would be a departure from it. You have moral commitments that tell you whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea. There is so much in your intelligibility of this thing that it's almost incalculable. The topic is more than the topic. Foucault would say what interests him about the topic is not necessarily this hypothetical choice presented in the literal sentence, but instead the structure of intelligibility that makes this topic a thing. Rather than looking at the hypothetical decision-making about the topic in a very strict and narrow sense, he'd want to say, why is this presented to us as a moral problem in the first place? How did we arrive at that point? What history, what institutions, what cultural patterns? That's what interests Foucault. Now, is that about the topic? Yeah. These things all are necessary for the topic to even make sense. He would say it's the heart of the topic. That's the heart of the topic. The foundations, formations, evolutions, and cultural significations, the whole subjective practice that makes us able to comprehend this is so deeply embedded and must be studied for what it was and what it has been and what created it and what forms and mentalities made it possible. That is way more important than what a bunch of high school students think the government should do today. For Foucault. Given that the topic is about surveillance, he could even, if he was alive today, he may be writing a book about this. I mean, it is so, because surveillance is such a huge technique of power. Pull something up here. Okay, we'll sit with that for a second. Surveillance is what he would call a technology of the self. A technology of the self. What he means by technology of the self, a term coined in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Technologies of the Self. I'm going to cite that source there. History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Technologies of the Self. A technology of the self is some sort of organization, some sort of institutional apparatus, some structure, be it physical or otherwise, that constructs the self. So, remember the panopticon. The idea that you could be watched at any time is a technology of the self because that directly influences your own relationship with your behavior, the decisions that you make, what you feel like you're allowed to do and not to do. That's why surveillance is a prime technology of the self. The reason why Foucault studied sexuality in his last 2 books before he died as his most important work. He was going to do 8 volumes of it. He did 2. The reason why he studied sexuality is because he wanted to know why individuals made the decisions they made in the privacy of their bedroom when no one was there except for the person they were with. Do they still abide by the moral code set out by society? Turns out they do. Why? That's a private space, and he's interested in how technologies itself even go into our private spaces. And so he would definitely be hugely interested in the question of surveillance. I mean, he already wrote about it in his book on prisons, Discipline and Punish. One of the things that a prison effectively does is surveil the prisoners. So, when it comes to the topic, Foucault's deep on it on both a literal and a methodological level. The topic is more than the topic. He would be deeply invested in the topic, but not with fiat. Now, we talked about technologies itself, which is a great segue to the most important aspect of Foucault. And we're gonna talk about this until I feel like we have it as a shared understanding, at least in some way. Because a lot of people say Foucault theorizes power. So he's about power. He's like a theory of power. Okay, I mean, true. He talks a lot about how power functions. But what he's really interested in is how power functions on the subject. How power constructs the subject. What is the subject? Well, that's a different lecture. If I ask the question, what is the subject, I could talk for an hour and a half. But we're not going to do that. The subject is described in a number of ways by a number of different people. It could be a person. It could be you. It could be an individual. It could be your mind. It could be your identity. Let's just simplify it. We have a subject here. That's our subject right now. That's the subject. We can have a whole discussion about what the subject is. I'm going to hopefully just be able to show you what Foucault's theory is about it. Okay? You have the subject, but the subject is not a bounded individual in the universe, uninfluenced by the world around them, where their identity is purely their own. You are not your Facebook profile. You are actually produced by forces in the world. So, what do I mean by that? What an individual is the result of an influence of society on it. There's a number of factors that influence the subject, that produce the subject. He loves that word, production. Production of the subject. And there's so many things that go into society's production of the subject. What makes an individual be who they want to be in this society? How does society produce them to be this or that thing or that or this thing? There's so many influences on a person. Think about your own life. The factors that influence who you are. You know, it's like where you were born, that's a big factor, like your material location, where you live, you know, your money. What are the things that influence you? And I'm asking you now. What are the things that go into influencing who you are? Yeah.
An education you want?
Yeah, your educational systems, for sure. For sure. Like, in fact, your educational system's stated objective is to shape you as an individual. Okay? What else? What other stuff influences us? Yeah.
Religion?
Yeah, religion's one, for sure. We got to raise you youngins up with some good moral values and everything. Yeah.
The media?
The media, for sure. Like, that media delivers you your messages about what's going on in the world. That's definitely a huge deal. Yeah.
People around you?
Yeah, you're like who you're surrounded by, your community. For sure. And there's so many things within that too. Like the peer pressure of your friends, your fear of your enemies, the expectations of the culture around you. Like there's so much stuff in here. Culture. Yeah?
Medical corrective institutions.
Yeah, sure. How you interact with medical institutions. Let's just name some institutions. I'm just going to put institutions right here. But let's just name some so we know what we're talking about. Name an institution. Yeah.
School.
Yeah, school. Name some more institutions.
Debate.
Huh?
Debate. Right?
Debate is an institution. Yes. Yes.
An asylum?
What do you mean?
Like it's an institution you have no right.
Oh, like for those with mental illnesses.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes. The whole psychological apparatus. There are so many different institutions than right. Therapists, social workers, places that house and imprison people. Like, there's so much that go into that, right? What other institutions do we have that influence us? Yeah.
The government.
Okay, yeah, the government, which includes like almost innumerable different sub-institutions that all influence in different ways, right? What other institutions? Yeah.
The economy count?
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
What else? There's a lot more. Yeah.
Actual media institutions like news stations.
Yeah, well, yeah, we have the media up there, but yes, definitely. Yeah.
Family?
Absolutely. Family is one of the oldest, most cultivated, and culturally defined institutions that there is. What we understand to be the role of a family in a person's life is an institutional understanding. It's culturally produced for a really long time, sets up expectations for what a family is supposed to be. Absolutely. Because an institution is not the building, or the road, or the fence, or the uniforms, or the agency. An institution is actually a collection of ideas and cultural influences. An institution is an arrangement of power. It's not the substance, material thing. An institution is an arrangement of power. We have so many things. I'm going to put the family in here just so we don't forget. You all know about how your family conditions you as a subject, obviously. That's why you came to debate camp for as many weeks as possible. All these institutions produce a subject. It's like if you think about all the things that exert influence over you, it starts to make you feel like you're not even an individual of free will. You don't even make choices. If you really start to think about all the things that have produced you to be what you are, the choices you've made in your life are really just the illusion of choice. There was things that conditioned you and created forks in the road, and you like picked one. Oh, I really asserted myself here, but like all these things created the fork in the road. There was a million other infinite options. You had this fork in the road. That fork was produced by all this, and either way you choose doesn't matter. It's quite easy when you start to think about this that you think, oh, my whole life is a lie. If you really think about it. But here is the most crucial aspect. Two most crucial aspects of Foucault's concept of the subject. I want you to think about this one. The subject also influences back out on the world. You influence the kids around you, right? You're going to build a life and create some kind of influence, magnified effect on the globe, you know? It might even be small and literal, but you'll take your little piece of this existence reality that we have, and you'll shape it a little bit, and that'll influence people around you, you know, like... The subject also influences the world around it. This is known as co-constitution. Co-constitution. The world constitutes us. Constitutes meaning produce, makes, okay? The world constitutes us, and we constitute the world. co-constitution. So to really understand how the world works, for Foucault, you don't have to look at all these outside institutions. You have to look at the subject and how it's produced and producing the world.
And so to understand the world, you have to look at the...
You have to look at this process of the production of the subject. Now, there's still to understand that really what institutions are made to do is shape individuals, and also understand that institutions are just a collection of individuals shaping the world. The subject is the key unit of analysis. There's a huge, big reveal in this model of the subject I have yet to produce. I will in a second, but I wanted to read something written by Foucault himself. The citation is The Subject and Power by Michel Foucault. The subject, if you're going to read something with Foucault in it, like you're going to read Agamben, biopower, blah, 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 bip, 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 you at least need to read The Subject and Power by Michel Foucault, which is written for him to clearly explain what the point of his theory is, given that it influences everything you're going to be reading about. Okay? The Subject and Power by Michel Foucault. It's just an essay. Just an essay. This is how he starts it out. The ideas that I would like to discuss here, this is the very opening of the essay, represent neither a theory nor a methodology. I would like to say, first of all, what has been the goal of my work in the last 20 years. It has not been to analyze the phenomena of power, nor to elaborate the foundations of such analysis. My objective instead has been to create a history of the different modes by which, in our culture, human beings are made subjects. My work has dealt with three modes of objectivization that transform human beings into subjects. The first of these modes of incongruity is the status of sciences. He talks about how he talks about the sciences. Then he looks at the objectivizing projective subject who labors in the analysis of wealth and economics. The objectivizing is the sheer fact of being alive in the natural history of biology. In the second part of his work, he talks about dividing practices. The subject is part of a whole process where you separate the mad from the sane, the healthy from the sick, the criminals from the good boys. Finally, he starts to study in his final turn of work. For example, I have chosen the domain of sexuality and recognize themselves as subjects in their secret private lives of sex. Thus, it is not a power of the subject. Thus, not power, but the subject that is the central theme of my research. This is what he's talking about. A lot of people say, like, he says biopower bad. Nope. He says, how does biopower produce the subject? He says state bad. Nope. He says, how does the state help influence the subject? He says fiat's bad. Nope. He says, how does the history of our social institutions and government shape the subject, not imagine the future? You see how that's a different approach to political thinking. Just entirely different type of analysis of political thinking. It is not compatible with traditional policy making. Now I need to add something to my model here, real quick. Yeah, what's up, Abe?
So does he take a stance on whether or not the subject is the predisposition of the subject is good or bad, or
No.
Right.
We'll talk about that in a little bit too. No, he's not about making moral value judgments. He's about finding the best description of the way things are. He thinks a lot of the moralism of we should think this and we should think that is a dangerous phenomenon. Okay. I forgot one arrow. Well, I didn't forget. I have not put up one arrow that's incredibly important. The subject also produces itself. Calls this a relation with the self. This is, for Foucault, is the most important process in what he calls subjectivization. This is the most important process of subjectivization. And subjectivization just means the way all these factors produce the subject. The way all these factors produce the subject. That's subjectivization. This whole process is the process of subjectivization. Okay? So he says the most important factor in the process of subjectivization is the relationship with the self. These things are power exerting itself over you. But you can't have power for Foucault without knowledge, the confluence of power and knowledge. It's like power has no power over you until the thing that it's influencing you to do becomes something that you know. Like, I have a lot less control over you in order for me to get me to do what you want, what I want you to do. I have to like physically make you do it. That's not that much power over, actually. That's just me using the fact that I'm big, old, and fat against you. If I'm really exerting control over you, the things I want you to think are things that you become to know. You just take them for granted. They become not things you're skeptical about, things you know. In a strict epistemological sense. I now know this thing to be true type of thing. I know it. The most powerful influence you can exert over someone is if in your influence of them, the thing that you're trying to get them to believe is something that they've come to know as a truth. That they take for granted as a given reality of things. So infinite power can push itself on you, but until it becomes caught in the nexus of power and knowledge, it's not truly influential. That's why the relationship with the self is the most important. Because you take these influences, blah, 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 and you create a given understanding of reality. Remember the structure of intelligibility? You all have successfully had the power of debate exerted over you. Because when you saw that topic, you knew what it meant. Not like a grandma would, but like a debater would. You saw the topic and you're like, there's the agent, there's the should, there's the planned action, it's a negative action, oh, the K, blah. You're already like midstream in it when you first see it. That is you having already had the power, knowledge, dynamic of debate influence so much over you that you already know things. You don't even have to think about it, it just snaps instinctually like, topic, oh, that K ground, like, you already know it. See what I'm saying? That's why the structure of intelligibility is so important, because it shows what you have turned into knowledge. Knowledge and power is how the subject gets produced. Okay? Okay, questions about this? Seriously. Seriously. For reals.
Other than the debate analogy, what's another example?
Oh, of like how subjects are produced through knowledge and power? Okay, educational systems. Very simplistic way to explain it is just like, there's been a lot of history. What makes it into your textbooks is an approved history. And if you seize all over that history and you're like, that's what the world is. And you're like, cool, you're a great history student, take AP history, you learn all the stuff, you read all the textbooks, you study it super awesome. Then you're in your sophomore history class in college. And you got a teacher with a long ponytail and a beard that they've never cut. And they're like, this is what really happened in the Vietnam War. And you're like, that's your college knowledge system rupturing because you have this whole structure of your understanding of the history of the world being disrupted by that professor. What influence does that have on the world around you? If that is never disrupted and there's a national election and they're like, we got to have another war to prevent the spread of this ideology, and you have been taught the history and have all these knowledge formations about what the Vietnam War was, and nobody, all of a sudden you're like voting for this president and approving of it. It's like your knowledge directly relates to the power of institutions that are around you.
So does it give What does it
There's
give?
power in all of it.
The power to decrease it.
Power is not a thing you can hold. Power is merely an exercise of relations over the subject and in the co-constitutive process. So there's power in the way you influence the world. There's power in how the world influences you. There's power in your relationship to the self. It's all power. Yeah.
When it comes to things such as like bedroom behavior, how did Foucault know that that's not like inherent human behavior, given that all institutions are also composed of humans and that's actually like socially imposed?
Well, I don't really want to talk about it in terms of appropriate because of some appropriateness lines, but he tracked how when certain Christian ideas came up, certain practices in the bedroom stopped and that kind of thing.
What books does he have that like traces? Like,
History of Sexuality, Volume 1 and 2.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
Does he take a stance on anything? Like, or is he just asking questions the whole time?
Is this not a stance? I don't know what you mean.
No, as in like, does he say anything's good or bad?
He says things are right, accurate, productive, and destructive. He comes from Nietzsche, you know? Like his secret favorite person ever is Nietzsche, even though so much of his writing is not really the same. He kind of approaches political philosophy without the old moralism that everyone has already assumed. And the reason why he does that is because he's all into Nietzsche, but yeah, he's less about, in fact, we're going to talk about that in 1 second. I'm going to like wicked answer that question. Okay? So, are you kind of with me on the subject is a production of power relations and intersecting forces mostly in combination with your own relationship with yourself and how you're internalizing those things and taking them for granted? Okay? We kind of with that? Okay. Politics. So we're going to get right to the heart of what you're thinking about. Politics. Traditional policy debate has its political philosophy foundations in the lines from Kant to Rawls. You don't really need to know that huge, okay? What we should know is traditional policy debate is not something that debate made up. It is the direct, you could draw a direct line from certain influences in political philosophy. And it has a theoretical foundation, which makes it something that's quite easy to defend. But you have to go like read about it, you know, and understand the political philosophical foundation of traditional policy debate. Well, it comes from this line from Kant to Rawls, and basically the thing that they were forwarding is morality and politics are inseparable. If you learn about political problems, that comes with an obligation for political solution. When we learn about the world around us, there is inherently morals built into it, and you have to learn how to make the right moral choice. To learn about how the world is to come with moral responsibility. And that's a huge... They really set the seed for our whole understanding of political philosophy in traditional policy debate. What they say is, the term political philosophy has become to associate with a form of thought that consists on producing prescriptive views. Prescriptive, do you know what that means? Prescriptive. Prescriptive views about the ways that politics ought to work as a reflection about morality. Okay, does anyone know what prescriptive means? Okay, if I said it's like a predictive moral statement. So it's like, if you follow this principle, you'll always be okay. You probably have a parent who's been like, but if you engage in abstinence, nothing bad will happen. I'm a father of 9 months, so like I'm really into that. Okay, so like super into that. But like prescriptions are like moral commitments that make like statements about how the world ought to be. It's pretty much like policy debate. It's like, if we pass the plan, this would happen. Status quo is like this. Pass plan. World like this after. That's a prescriptive political philosophy commitment. And for a long time, the traditional political philosophy was about what we do in traditional policy debate, which is just like, let's look at these different options for political reforms. Which one would be the best one morally? We're going to pick this because it's the best one morally. Boom. Okay? That's what you can understand as traditional political philosophy. Started with Kant, developed through Rawls, became taken for granted and the way things were for like a long time. Okay? But there is a whole tradition that stayed alive, that existed even before that, that saw political philosophy primary task as descriptive. It's sort of like if we misunderstand the problem in the first place and make a bunch of solutions that were hypothetically thrown around, that's not really good political thinking. That's really just setting us up to make a persistent policy problem stay with us forever. So what we should do instead is seek to understand the foundations of our political reality better. And so there's a whole area of scholarship within political philosophy that is all about that. And so when you ask, does he take a stance? Yeah, he takes tons of stances in this descriptive world. But he disagrees with the focus of prescriptive politics in the way that we do it in a traditional way. So he says, like, yes, if you are in the government, so for example, Foucault rallied to a bunch of activist causes and demanded a bunch of reforms for human rights around the world. Refugees, anti-racism, prison reform. Like, he believed in a number of governmental policies. He did. And he was an activist for him. So it's not like he pretends like there is no politics in the world. But he thinks when it comes to political philosophy, i.e., the task of figuring out politics, that it's better for us to do this type of thing. Like, we don't have our hands on the levers of power if we're not the government, if we're not the policymakers. He thinks it's better for us to make a contribution that figures out and understands the history of politics better, rather than having us being like, this is what they should do. So there's a big difference in terms of his approach to political philosophy. Rather than the moral prescriptive of Kant and Rawls, he's more of the classical tradition of political philosophy that's like, we should try to understand the foundation of politics better. Yeah?
Is that possible to deploy around Sam's having a specific epistemological insight of the one you see and to say, in general, we can't know that until we have a longer...
You can, but it's always better to point out that the thinking of the affirmative is problematic than to just say, this is something that we like better. So you can, but he would do a more combined approach. He would do both of those things. He would
Does
be
it have like an external impact to doing?
All the time.
Okay.
So because what, and I'm actually getting that right now. If we use improper descriptive elements to talk about how the world that is, to define and solve problems, to think about and theorize about politics, we end up contributing to the continual deterioration of our politics. Because in his political philosophy, when he starts to understand the foundation of politics that we see today, and he really is trying to understand the foundations of the modern democracy, like what led to the modern democratic societies we have today, he finds that we have become a society where our institutions, all these influences, are beginning to shut out independence, freedom, independence of identity, that the governing of the subject is becoming so powerful that we are losing free will. And in fact, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, he arrives at this place where he's just like, what we've lost in the evolution of our cultural institutions from the beginning to now is freedom. We have only the illusion of choice left and nothing else. And so he's like, we are accelerating down a dangerous path. He even has a part where he ties the nuclear bomb to it. Okay, like he's like, we are going down a path that will lead to our ultimate destruction. Either all of us dead or a life not worth living. So that seems to be the end of the road of where we're going. But the reason why it happened is because of how much we've accelerated the process of the subjugation of the subject. So he's saying the real task of our time is to interrupt the thinking that makes this process continually advanced. We have to And the way you interrupt that thinking is through description, not prescription. You begin to think differently about the foundations, the purpose, and the meaning of all of these institutions. The real task is a descriptive one. We have to come to understand political problems differently. Because the process of our society is so deeply embedded in our very understanding of the world that we have to direct our attention to the way that we understand the world around us. That's his focus of politics. That's when he says politics, that's what he means. He's like, yeah, I'm totally political. I'm political at this level. At the most important level. The way the world actually functions through the process of subjectivization, which is just a collection of individuals all being produced by power. My politics is in that realm, which is actually the most important place because that's how the world is made. So he would say, I am super political, but just not that way. Yeah?
So I understand like what a prescriptive like mindset would be, what would it be like a descriptive one? So like
it would say we need to go back and reframe our understanding of the criminal if we really want to solve the surveillance problem. There's a deeper issue.
okay, so
You know what I mean? So it's like, before we get into what should we do about surveillance today, we have to first solve the fact that we think there's a number of criminals around us we have to watch. See what I'm saying? Because that's a deeper problem that's more historically formed. That is really the true problem here. Is not, should we have cameras on the street corner, is like, a long time ago we decided there was a bunch of undesirables we needed to really keep an eye on. Why do we think that? Let's instead change our understanding at a deeper level, core level that cuts to who we are as subjects, and that actually has a better influence on the problem of surveillance in general. Does that make sense? The description that we have of the problem is incredibly important in terms of that. Yeah.
Okay, so on the opposite, I understand descriptive, I don't understand prescriptive. So
Prescriptive is like, okay, let's look at that same problem. Okay, we got a problem with surveillance today. What reform should we make today to...
So it's just like medicine, you have to describe the disease and then you prescribe to fix it.
Right, if you're really good at making prescriptions but you're really bad at understanding what diseases someone has, then it doesn't really matter.
So if you prescribe the
It's like I've got the best pills ever, but I have no idea who should take them. You know what I mean? Like, it's like prescription versus descriptive. You gotta have, so he's like, our problem is, all of political philosophy is so caught in Kant and Rawls, everything we need to do is about hypothetical testing of what we should do today. That we just continually, whatever we think our reform is, it's just the same thing that was before, because we can't think out of a pattern that is so embedded in us that nothing really changes. So he's like, the only way to really make a radical change from the politics of the status quo is to not think about prescription, but the way that we understand what is in the first place. To not think about the future, but like, how do we arrive at this point? And then maybe if we do that, a reform will come to our heads that's radically different. But we have to go about it in the right process. Interestingly enough, when Karl Marx, you know who Karl Marx is?
Yeah.
This guy that wrote Communist Manifesto? Okay. When he was young, before he was a communist, he wrote this awesome essay that Foucault really likes, where he coined the phrase, where he said that his project was to engage in a ruthless criticism of all that exists. That's what Karl Marx said. I'm engaging in a ruthless criticism of all that exists. And Foucault would later joke that, yeah, he was on that project, and he started with capitalism. And then he died. Changed him for the worse. Foucault really likes the ruthless criticism of all that exists. In terms of political thinking and in terms of debate thinking, this shifts presumption. Bingo, red flag word. This shifts presumption. This is an argument you can explain on your K. You don't presume that the plan is better than the status quo, right? That's our classic presumption. If all things are equal, then you just pass the plan, because obviously you do stuff. Okay, that's our presumption. For him, the presumption is shift. You should err on the side of not doing stuff. Because you should be skeptical of prescriptive moral claims that have not questioned what they have taken for granted. Because he's looking at the whole trace of history and seeing that society continually becomes worse and less allowable for the freedom of the subject. And so he's like, the more we do stuff, the worse So it's like we should have a presumption of skepticism to action. Rather than always jump into action, we should think, how did we arrive at that solution? Why are we thinking? So he's always trying to look beneath the thing. So that shifts presumption. That's a great argument on whatever K you're reading, okay? You can make that Foucault argument. It's just like, look, if you trace the history of this thing we're talking about, you see that the actions that get taken only make the problem worse. So that means that we ought to shift presumption to err on the side of not acting. That actually is a good description for a judge. You know? Yeah?
Okay, so is like Foucault's alternative just to like think about the roots of where we get things, or does he have some other way of
He actually ends with his, I don't know if his alternative is the right phrase, but you should, okay, I have two levels of answer to this question. First is you should see Foucault as a framework argument for all Ks. That's the best strategic use of it. You should just combine his arguments as the framing arguments for whatever you've got going on. I wouldn't want to run all Foucault all the time. My whole K is just like the things Foucault said. Because he died early, he was just barely starting to work on his alternative at the time of his death. And it was about, he called it the care of the self. It had dealt with this relationship with the self. And it was about how you can relate to yourself to get more freedom. You know. But that's not, there's other alternatives that other people that love Foucault and write about Foucault write that are better. You know what I mean? But the Foucault stuff should be the basis for your understanding for how your K is framed in the debate. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. So that's politics. Next is the round. Just a debate idea, the round. Each round. Do you think Foucault would disagree with traditional fiat policymaking on what the purpose of the round is? Yeah. The purpose of the round is not to compare the plan for status quo, combat policy option, bit. The purpose of the round is to look at the problem of the topic and to come to a better understanding of the political world that is. Let me ask you, is the round more like policy making, like the things that people that work in the government do? Or is it more like political philosophy? I'm curious what you think. Is a debate round more like the act of executing government policy? Or is it like political philosophy? Thoughts? Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole other event dedicated to the former, so probably more or less the latter, right?
Why?
I don't know, I think political philosophy is more, like, you can go to a Congress debate if you want to, like, actually try to pass things like a, you know, like...
That is more like Congress.
Yeah, exactly, and so it makes more sense to talk about the political
Well, and even if you think about it in terms of agency action, too, which is relevant because we're talking about USFG, right? The act of an administrator operating over an agency is a lot different than a debate round. Making the policies as an administrator of, like, the FBI is nothing like a debate round. Most aspects of policymaking are really divorced from the practices that we do in debate. Even when they're having floor debates in Congress, those things are not how we do them. And mostly the act of policymaking in Congress is about deal making and interest convergence and things like that. Decision-making trees. And it's not necessarily about a judge deciding who won or lost, you know, because the people giving speeches get to control their own votes. So it's just very different to make policy than to debate about it. When you're debating about policy, that's much more like being in a discussion of political philosophy. What should be done is a big grand question that's a political philosophy question. Now, if Foucault found himself on the floor of the Senate, he would vote up, down on policies and write bills and pass policies. But he, like us, was in an academic setting, just having discussions about what should be done. So he didn't see passing of policies as primary objective. It's like, we're just debating about, like, politics here. Perhaps our focus is important and how we come to know things is important here. given that it's an academic setting about political philosophy. And so a lot of times when he was at conferences, which is kind of like his rounds, people would ask him, what's your position on this policy and that one and this one? And he would say, there are places where I would talk about that, but here at this conference, which is a lot like our tournaments, I'm going to say we should focus on something else. I'm interested in that question, but the way that I'm interested in it means we need to look back at the foundations of it. He would never answer, up, down, yes, no, even though people knew that he was involved in activism in his life. So what does that mean to our round? The round is not, for a Foucauldian, the round is not a place for us to do the Kant-Rawls thing, because that just means that the thing where we just talk about moral prescriptions. Because that means that we're never really getting to a better understanding of where we've been or how we understand the world. We're just sort of playing with the knowledge that has been given to us and not deepening or changing any of it. He would say that each round, if we go to the prescriptive realm, by reinforcing what we already know and sort of in a game, just reinforces all these power dynamics. But that the round does have an essential possibility to deepen, change our understanding of the world that is, if it's more of a descriptive process. If the team that wins is the one that's like, describes the world the best, with the best understanding of what makes the problem of surveillance possible. Then it's a quality academic discussion that gets at the heart of the matter. The round is not a House of Congress. You don't want to know what the round is, really? The round is one of the most excellent places to see this process on display. You're applying what you know in contrast to opposing ideas. You're bringing everything that has been your cultural, personal, intellectual, educational, moral history to the table and having a debate about it, reinforcing, you're really in your head, right? Your processor is going off the chain. Okay? You're calling from this background knowledge and that one and this book and that. It's like the debate round, what it really is one of the most essential sites for you in your life for power, knowledge, subject construction. The debate round is a process of subjectivization. More than it is a process of policymaking. Yeah. The debate round is a process of subjectivization, the construction of the subject, much more than it is a process of policymaking. And if that's what a debate round is, that changes the terms of a lot of framework arguments. Am I wrong? I mean, if you can win that, a debate round is much more about the construction of the subject than it is about policymaking, you're in good shape if you're running a K. That waves away a lot of their business. Okay? But I want to also emphasize the flip side. What if you just knew what the Kant-Rawls thing was, and you read a little bit of Rawls, and you knew like why it was good to have prescriptive discussions about policies, and then you also, oh my God, you read an article that's like, that's better than Foucault. Then you are also good, because you can be like, no, prescriptive discussions about policymaking are the best moral choice, they make a better world, it's the only process of incremental progress and reform, and here's like real academic research about this very question. That's also winning debate. No matter what kind of debate you do, you have to engage this question, because if you're doing traditional policy debate, you should know why. And if you do, you'll be better at defending it. And thinking about Foucault and his objections to it make you better at defending your foundation too. That's the purpose of the round. So think about how, in any K you want to read, I don't care if it's feminism, the most wild queer theory, most performative weird stuff, race, class, or whatever white European you'd like to read. That argument, this distinction, this as the focus of the debate round helps you. If you're saying we should be looking at gender, you think gender's involved in this? Uh-huh. Big time. In fact, contemporary gender theorists like Judy Butler, she's Foucauldian. In fact, Foucault is where she gets all of her orientation to the subject on the question of queer theory comes from. All these people, so much race scholarship is about this. It's like, can you understand the dynamic of how racism occurs through this lens? Yeah. Can you understand how racism is internalized? Yes. Like, this model combines with most critical theory and debate. And if you can make this the focus of the debate round, almost any K can win. Okay, let's talk a little about, well, okay, we got to talk about the state. We at least need to talk about the state. What is the state? Well, the government is not just the government. Just like the resolution is not just the resolution, the topic is not just the topic, the individual is not just the individual, okay? History is not just history, the status quo is not just the status quo, the state is not just the state. The government is not a thing, it's an idea, which is why he uses the term governmentality. Governmentality, like if you put a dash in it. There isn't one in it. But when I do, it seems that people understand it better. Governmentality. The state is not just like these buildings over there on the hill. This is the state, or these cops. The state is an organization, thought process. And what he does for it is governmentality is just the conduct of conduct. Meaning all of the institutions, apparatuses, forms of control that exert power over influence, like we want those people to be like this, so we're going to conduct their conduct, we're going to shape their behavior. The law, all that. The state for him, the government, is less of a focus than governmentality. If we really want to understand how the government works, you don't learn about all the offices and the powers of the president. You learn about governmentality for Foucault. What is the process of thinking that leads to the conduct of others' conduct? Is that ignoring and walk away from the state? He would say no, that's actually the only way to truly understand the state. Okay, there's more, like this is my area, this Foucault thing. We have a number of Foucault-influenced arguments at the tournament, and there's more, there's so much more, there's so much. There's no way I could have told you even close to what you need to know. What I think you should know at the end of this is that an understanding of this really does shape a perspective on debate. A whole perspective on debate that like all of our Ks have been birthed out of. All. The first K was a critique of fiat with Foucault cards in it. Okay? And so if you want to get good at your K, please please read these books I'm about to recommend. Are you ready to type? You really want to understand Foucault, you must read the following things. First, Essential Works of Foucault. The volume that's entitled Power. There's this really great Essential Works of Foucault thing. There's 3 volumes. One of them is Power. You have to read everything in there. Okay? Next thing you have to read. You probably have to read all of History of Sexuality, Volume 1. and the introduction and conclusion of History of Sexuality, Volume 2. You probably got to read Discipline and Punish. That's another book. And then you have to watch the YouTube videos of Foucault debating. Because he loves debate. He like thrashes Noam Chomsky in this awesome debate. Okay? So you then have to also just go watch his way of debating. And you can debate like he debates. Like it's directly translatable. Okay? We don't really have time for questions. I'm sorry, I just have a lot of ground to cover. If you want to talk to me about more of this stuff and get help on it or whatever, you know, I'll be around. We're all working in the same place. There was more things I could have got to, but I feel like hopefully at least your understanding Foucault's a little bit better. Thank you very much.